Welcome, listeners. This is Sarah Wallace, and I am here today to interview author Kayla Kumari Upadhyaya. Hello, Kayla.
Hi.
Thank you for coming on the pod. We're going to be talking about your books and your essays. So you have written Helen House, which is a sapphic horror novelette.
Yes, a word I learned after I wrote it. I'd heard of a novella. I'd never heard of a novelette. So I was like, oh, cool. There's a word for it.
I know, I really like novelettes. I feel like we should have more of them out there, really.
I agree.
So tell us about Helen House. Tell us about why you're excited to talk about that one.
Yeah, so I wrote Helen House a few years ago, and the reason why I wrote it was I had initially sat down to write a short story. I was writing mainly short fiction at the time. I still do write short fiction. I love short fiction. And so I sat down to start working on what I thought was going to be a short story. And when I got to the end of it, I realized how much I'd written, and it was like over 8,000 words, which just generally is a little long to be considered a short story. Yes. And, most like literary journals and stuff like don't even really publish work that's that long. They usually have like a cap off at like 4,000, 6,000. Every once in a while you can find one that's like 8,000, but over that, no way. So this was like pushing 8,500 words. And so I kind of put it to the side for a little bit and said, I don't really know what this is. I played around with the idea of like significantly expanding it, kind of thought out if I could make it into a novel. I experimented too with cutting it down and trying to make it about half the length, and like neither really seemed to be the right solution. So I was like, okay, I'm just gonna let this be what it is. Just because I don't know if there's a place for it in the publishing world doesn't mean that like I shouldn't turn into something it's not. So I did put it to the side, and then not long after that, Ryan Rivas at Burrow Press, micro press here in Florida, reached out to me and asked if I had anything that was kind of like a short story too long to be considered a short story, is like basically how he put it.
What? That's so cool.
Exactly. And because Burrow Press has this like books program, they put out like 3 books a year, and the idea is that they are all very short books. So it was kind of just perfect. And then, I worked with Ryan to kind of like take Helen House to the next level as a draft. Ended up expanding significantly on it, but still, was short enough to be, considered not even a novella, but a novelette. But that was kind of the origin story. It was a little bit like, I didn't sit down because somebody asked me once, what made you decide to write a novelette specifically? And I was like, I didn't. It just happened to me. It was not something I like sat down and consciously was trying to write. Like, I did not think it would be my first book, and it just kind of all worked out in a really lovely way. Yeah.
That's amazing. I love that. And can you give us like a quick pitch on what Helen House is about?
Yes. So Helen House is about a woman who is going to meet her girlfriend's parents for the first time, kind of a classic setup. And shortly before they're going to see the parents, her girlfriend confesses to her that she's kept a big secret for the entirety of their relationship, which is that she used to have a sister who died as a child. And when she reveals that information, our narrator, who remains unnamed for the whole book, she is like, it's really weird that you lied to me about this, especially because I have a dead sister and you know that.
Oh.
So this narrator, she's lost her sister more recently. It's kind of a fresher wound, but she's going to meet the girlfriend's parents. She gets there and she kind of realizes that things in this house are very strange. It's very hot inside the house, unnaturally hot, almost supernaturally hot. And it becomes clear that her girlfriend's family is still haunted by the loss of the other daughter when she was very young, and kind of how the haunting goes from there. Yeah, but it takes place in a very short amount of time, just in the space of this kind of trip to see the parents, and then we kind of move into some flashback and things like that. But really just a lot of it is kind of just taking place over this kind of day and a half, basically.
That's awesome. I love that. That's such a cool premise.
Thank you.
What drives your storytelling, specifically with Helen House or in general?
Yeah, I think like, especially just writing horror specifically, I really am drawn to these ideas of exploring themes that I find personally interesting, but in a very heightened way, kind of taking it and figuring out like, okay, what is the horror twist that I can put on this concept or this theme? That's something that I love to do. And yeah, with Helen House, I feel like, I wanted to tell a spooky story. I wanted there to be a ghost element, a haunted house element, but I also ultimately wanted it to be a story about grief and the different ways that people deal with grief or don't deal with grief. I mean, yeah, every ghost story you see is going to be dealing with grief in some way, grief or loss and things like that. And I just wanted to kind of take those tropes and kind of put my own little spins on them.
That's really cool. I love that. What motivates you to write, and what do you hope to accomplish with your stories?
Basically, if a reader has any kind of reaction to the work I've made, that is great. That's exactly what I want. I don't care what the reaction is, but if it makes them feel something, and then I feel like that is, what more could I hope for? And yeah, I just really like the idea of contributing to this kind of growing canon of queer horror, just queerness within horror. I feel like this is an incredible genre and something that I care about a lot.
What is specifically about, I love that queer horror is an emerging genre right now, and what is
Yeah.
it that specifically connects you to it, and what do you love about the genre specifically?
So for the first half of my life, I actually hated horror. I hated anything scary. I hated scary movies, anything like that. I completely did not engage with horror at all. And I tell this story a lot, and it sounds too perfect to be true, but it is 100% true that when I came out as queer, I also came out as a horror lover. There was something.
Oh, fascinating.
I think I was just so repressed in this one way, and horror just felt too intense, or it was popping some sort of bubble or something. So I really had avoided it for so long, and then I came out, I was less repressed, I was more myself, and I realized that I really like scary movies and horror. So it kind of happened at the same time for me. So it also means that I just have all these kind of super emotional attachments to certain horror films that I watched as I was getting into horror, because it was also at a time in my life where I was coming out.
That's awesome. Do you have a favorite character you've created? And if so, who and why?
I feel like this question really stumped me. It's such a cop-out, but I feel like I like all of my characters.
That's fair.
Which is also just funny because a lot of the characters I write are deeply, deeply flawed people. Deeply, deeply unlikable characters. Very flawed. I mean, it's horror, and something that I like to play a lot within horror is who is the monster, or is one monster to someone, I like these kind of existential questions about horror, and especially considering queerness with them as well. So yes, long story short, all my characters are people I would never want to know in real life, but I love to write them. I would not be friends with any of them, I don't think, but I think that's just how I feel about character in general, is I love all my little messed up characters.
That makes sense. Kind of related to that, I was recently talking to my co-author, and we were talking about self-insert in characters, and
Yeah.
I tend to have always defined that as writing a character that is basically me. But she was saying that she considers any character that has any shared personality traits or any shared flaws or behaviors or thoughts in general is kind of a self-insert. So it kind of made me reframe how I think of whether or not I self-insert.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
Yeah. And so with that in mind, are there I know you just said your characters are deeply flawed and you wouldn't want to be friends with any of them, but how do you tend to write, especially considering it's queer horror specifically and kind of an exploration of queerness within the horror genre? Are there any characters that you feel like you kind of add any of yourself to, or you find yourself in any of your characters?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, not in the case of Helen. Well, in Helen House, yes, I would say that's true as well. The narrator does share some things in common with me, and that is something I do a lot. And some of my short fiction, I would even consider autofiction a little bit. Again, I'm adding some horror elements and stuff like that, and I've never personally been haunted in real life, but in a metaphorical sense, sure. So I'm always trying to find things kind of inspiration from my life and my experiences, but try to figure out what would this look like if this was a horror story.
I love that. That's really cool. What stories inspire you?
Yeah, well, I'll talk a little bit specifically about Helen House and its inspirations, because I do feel like I'm inspired by so much work that I'll give it a little bit of a focus. So for Helen House specifically, I had just read 2 books back to back that are very, very different. One was Luster by Raven Leilani, and the other one was Bag of Bones by Stephen King. So very different books. Bag of Bones is like probably over 400 pages. Luster is a very short novel. You know, we were talking about it, I think, before we started recording, but, or maybe we were recording already. I love a short novel. Like, I love the novelette, I love the novella, and then just a short novel, which I kind of consider anything like 250 pages or less, like around that. And I'm always wanting more of that. So I'd read Luster. I was like, what a great short novel. And then I read this giant Stephen King horror book right after it, and just like such a different vibe. But both of those works ended up inspiring Helen House, because what I really wanted to do with Helen House was write a sexy ghost story. I wanted there to be these ghost elements, but I also like wanted there to be this kind of like erotic element to it, which is a big part of the book. I just don't want to say too much because spoilers. But yeah, I do consider it like erotic horror. And so yeah, it was weird. I took those Luster and Bag of Bones and kind of smashed them together. And that was really like the direct inspiration for the book. Yeah.
That's amazing. Going from short fiction to Stephen King is quite a leap.
Yes.
You kind of touched on this a little bit, but what's the number one thing you want readers to take away from your book?
Yeah, I think I do often especially when I'm writing horror, I do want to kind of challenge people on what it means to be a monster, to be monstrous, or to be, you know, the quote unquote normal like villain of a horror story. Or I want people to kind of question the binary of like good versus evil in horror, and just see that like all people are complicated. Yeah. And I remember I had workshopped a short story of mine at a workshop, and one of the readers, her feedback was saying that she was like, well, I can't really tell who the villain is. Like, I can't tell who the villain is. And I was like, yeah, that's what I meant to do.
You got it.
Yeah, she wanted me to like pick a bad guy for my own story, and I was like, no, that's like not the point. Like, it's like the point is actually for you to be a little confused right now about who you can relate to, or who you think is, you know, the bad one. I was like, so I'm wanting readers to kind of take away almost a sense of like ambivalence and kind of like questioning and challenging of like what they expect from horror and horror tropes. Yeah.
That's really cool. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
And like that kind of touches on, kind of segues us into like themes, like other than monstrous and monsters within us and the binary between good and evil. Are there any other themes you like to explore?
I always joke that I write what I consider relationship horror. Like when people are like, what kind of horror do you write? I'm like, relationship horror. And what I mean by that is like the vast majority of like the stories I write, and Helen House also falls into this, are kind of about these interpersonal dynamics and creating horror within that. So, you know, whether it's between exes or, a partner, but a partner who has lied, like kind of looking at these relationships that people have as the haunted thing, and like, finding fun metaphors to kind of explore that. That's something that I feel like a lot of my work is doing, this concept of relationship horror.
That's such a great like subgenre.
Yeah.
What drew you to that subgenre, or like in general, like queer horror?
Yeah, I think it was just, you know, being such a lover of horror, and, you know, a lover of queer horror as well, which, you know, and it's a great time to be a queer horror fan, because there's just a lot of it out there, but there's also, I think, a lot of actual like kind of critical work being done as well. Like the Feminist Press put out the anthology It Came From the Closet, and it was all queer and trans writers writing about horror films, which I thought was really cool too. And something that I do a lot of at Autostraddle, where I'm an editor, is, you know, queer takes on movies that aren't necessarily considered queer. So these kind of like queering and transing of the text, like that's something that is so exciting. So yeah, I was just a fan of the genre before I was even writing in it. Absolutely. And I do feel, in addition to being inspired by books and other writing, I am very inspired in my work by film. So, you know, and the first queer horror that I was exposed to was all in film. And so I feel very influenced by some of those early films that I saw. And I'm always thinking, you know, I don't think I write cinematically, but I do think sometimes in terms of, like what would this look like on screen and things like that. Yeah, just being a lover of the genre made me want to write it.
I totally get that. That's really cool. And like, I would like to at least for a little bit talk about, because you write a lot of nonfiction as well, like essays
Hmm.
and articles for Autostraddle and stuff. So like I'd love to talk about that, especially like doing like queer readings of film and television that isn't historically been considered queer, or adding a queer reading to it. And I don't know, like as a genre writer, like I'm fascinated by like, what pulls you to writing nonfiction and queer nonfiction, and is there any projects or topics that you haven't touched on yet in your essay writing that you would like to tap into more in the future?
Yeah, so writing nonfiction was really how I got started in writing. My first writing job was for my college newspaper. I was an arts journalist there, so I was doing TV criticism, film criticism, music criticism, all of it. I was an editor there, and that was just really my first exposure to writing, and I fell in love with writing that kind of pop culture criticism. And yeah, then after I graduated and left college, those were the first jobs I had as well. I was a freelance TV critic for a really long time. But, in addition to just writing these kind of straight reviews, I was also starting to write a lot of kind of more essay work that pulls from pop culture. And then it was in 2015 that I started writing for Autostraddle. And that was, the first time that I was really writing about my life in a consistent way. Wrote a lot, personal essays and things like that, kind of combination, like review personal essays. Yeah, and I've been at Autostraddle now as a full-time editor for a couple of years too. So not only am I able to, have a job where I get to write every day, which is incredible.
Yeah, the dream.
I'm also working with other queer and trans writers as their editor. And that's like another thing that I really, really love, is the kind of, my editor hat that I wear. But yeah, I love essay work. There are definitely essays that I haven't written yet that kind of feel like my like white whale essay. Like it's in particular, I've been working on one about beginning to play tennis again as an adult after having played very seriously in my youth and then stopped for a long time. I've been like tinkering with this essay for a couple months now. It still feels very far away from being complete. So I don't know, like every essay kind of starts with some sort of curiosity of my own, something I'm trying to like figure out about myself or like my life, the world around me. And so, yeah, I get very obsessive. And when I start to be obsessed with something, that's when I'm like, oh, time to write an essay.
Are there any like essays that you are particularly proud of, or that you would like, if someone listening to the podcast who's never read any of your essays, like what would be, your pièce de résistance that you would like point them to as like, this is the one, or these are the two that you should read, or whatever?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, well, I should just go with the first thing that came to mind probably. And the first thing that came to mind was I wrote an essay for Autostraddle a couple years ago now about turning 30, but it was kind of a reflective essay of, it was basically a recap of my 20s, but, told in kind of like, non-chronological essay form.
Oh, cool.
I feel like that in particular is like very kind of representative of a lot of the like personal essay work that I do. So I think that's a good one. Yeah.
What advice do you have for aspiring authors?
Yeah, so something that I've been talking about with other writers a lot lately is like, I'm always encouraging myself and others to kind of move away from the idea of like, but how marketable is my work? Like how, moving away from that word, marketable, and just writing the thing that you actually want to write. Like, of course, like finances are important. Like, and if people are wanting to write for a living, like it's important to consider these things, but not up front. Like make the work first and then kind of figure out that other stuff, because also like, yeah, there probably isn't a market, quote unquote, for my book Helen House, but it got published anyway at a micropress, and it's like it's found the right people. It's it's a very non-traditional publishing path, but I wouldn't have it any other way, because I was like, I never had to make any compromises on that book. I didn't have to change anything. I got so much say, so much control, so much say in the design process, which is also important, because not only there's the cover obviously, but internally Helen House, it has illustrations.
Oh, that's the best.
Which I kind of wanted like a scary stories to tell in the dark vibe. So, and I think the artist Kira Gondek Silva, who did it, just executed it flawlessly. But I got to be a part of that conversation and kind of decide things. And
that's amazing.
Yeah, I opted for no blurbs, like just all these things that like wouldn't be available to me if I did a more traditional kind of publishing journey for the book.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was gonna ask what it's like to work with a small press, but you basically answered that. So that's really cool.
I love it. I love it. I think even if I ever did kind of pursue a bigger press, I would still continue to do something with small presses. I just like, yeah.
So, since you write both fiction and nonfiction, do you like have a preference between one or the other, or is there any like overlap when it comes to when you're writing fiction or nonfiction? Have you found that like one strengthens the other, or does like one influence how you write the other?
Yeah, I think that they definitely influence each other. I feel like all of the writing I do, even the stuff that's like pretty strictly like quote unquote day job, it's all kind of touching each other in some way. Like for as a tangible example, one of the many many things I do at Autostraddle and many things I write at Autostraddle is I answer advice questions that we get sent. A lot of them are about relationships, a lot of them are about breakups, like all these things. And definitely I've pulled some inspiration from those, because what you realize from, reading advice letters is that, yeah, kind of like the characters I'm putting in my stories, everyone is pretty flawed. It's like,
Yeah, that's so cool.
yeah, so, I never like directly copy something that somebody is saying that happened to them, but I definitely pull some inspiration from situations that we get advice questions for.
Is there anything else you want to talk about before we close out the episode? Anything we didn't touch on?
No, I think we covered everything I wanted to talk about. I'm glad I got to, extol the virtues of small presses at the end there, too.
Yay! Small presses are so great.
Yes, they're putting out some of the just most interesting books. Yeah, yeah.
They are. I think small presses really need a lot more hype than they get. I feel like in the writing and publishing world, I feel like when in the discussion of writing and publishing, people tend to think of like, okay, there's trad publishing and then there's self-publishing, and it's kind of like, oh, if you're trad published, you're a big five published author, or you're indie published.
Yeah, there's this whole middle area.
Yeah, there's a whole middle area that really has more. It's a nice like kind of, I don't know, blend of the two from what I understand of it, where
I think so too. Yeah.
I feel like you get a lot of like the backing of a group of people who are going to work together to help your book come together,
Totally.
which is like the benefit of a trad publishing route. But then, like you were saying, you get more say and more creative freedom than you would with a big five publisher.
Absolutely. Yes.
So definitely, we love small presses. So where can our listeners find you?
Yeah, so I'm at Kayla Kumari on all social media. Snag that username on every single platform. But I write almost every single day for autostraddle.com. So if you go to the website, good chances that you will stumble upon my writing. Yeah.
Thank you, Kayla, for joining us. This is Sarah Wallace, and thank you for listening to Right Here, Right Queer, and we will catch you later.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us.